Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. I'll be your host for today, Kripa Koshy, and I'm a program manager here at Takshashila. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by my colleague, Sarthak, who is an assistant professor of economics in the policy school here. Welcome, Sarthak.
Thanks, Kripa, for having me here.
I'm really excited about the topic we're going to discuss today, which is, as the title of this episode has already given away, we're going to discuss economic boycotts. Is it a bane? Is it a boon? And I'm hoping that our time together will help listeners answer that question a little bit. So I thought maybe I'll start with a little bit of context setting, if that works. Yeah. So I guess it's no surprise, when I talk about this subject, simply because it's occupied a lot of airtime, it seems, in mainstream media particularly. Just this past week, a lot of headlines were reporting the news of Le Boycott, which is a movement now in France, where French customers are trying to make an effort to reject American brands. So, of course, this includes a lot of big-name retailers are implicated, like a McDonald's, Coca-Cola. And interestingly, in a lot of the news reports, they are citing a poll that was conducted fairly widely in France, where it was reported that 6 out of 10 French consumers supported such an economic boycott. Interestingly, important to note, I think, that France is the US's third largest European trading partner. And so there's a lot of activity here of, customers trying to express their displeasure, their dissatisfaction with how global affairs are going along. And of course, talking about how they're also unhappy with how their country is sort of treated in the midst of all of this, right? That they're on the receiving end of, there were, of course, news of tariffs being applied to alcohol and such in the French market as well. So that's what's been catching my attention through the week.
Yeah, so Kripa, since you mentioned that this has been in the news cycle, I would like to point that the mechanism of economic boycotts is not new, right? It has been used in the past. In fact, it was one of the most prominent mechanism used during India's independence struggle also, right? The Swadeshi movement.
Great point, yeah.
Right, so where, again, the different freedom fighters back then, they called Indians to not use foreign goods, right? So economic boycotts has been there before. Yeah. And in recent times, it has been hogging the news cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's good. I think it's helpful to have that sort of cultural context to say that it's long been used as a tool for people to express this type of dissatisfaction with government policy sometimes, with, how certain
corporate policies also.
Corporate policies as well, yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad that we went a little bit back in history, because it's probably good to situate some of it in historical context. I mean, right you are, it's dated so far back, right, to even independence movement in India. But the earliest account from what I've read is, in sort of the 1700s, where there was actually a British campaign to stop buying sugar that was produced by enslaved Africans in the West Indies. So this began usually in a lot of these American colonies, where Quakers were rejecting purchasing sugar, in this period. And they felt as though since, Africans were stolen people and were enslaved in this, capacity, that therefore their products also should be considered as stolen goods, and therefore they should not participate in purchasing some of these things. So typically when we are saying what a boycott is, I think listeners understand what we mean, but perhaps it's useful to sort of outline specifically. Boycott is collective, organized ostracism and it's usually applied across multiple contexts. So labor, economic, political, social relations, and usually it's supposed to express protest against practices that you regard as unfair. So you feel like that's a fair representation of when we're saying what a boycott is, right?
Definitely.
But we're limiting our conversation today on economic boycotts, really. And I think one last thing before I turn to you, Sarthak, just to talk about the two kinds of boycotts when we are speaking of them. There's a primary boycott, which is, maybe a decision not to buy goods or services produced by a certain company or a country whose policies you may disagree with. And so that's the example that you brought up earlier here in India. And when people speak about boycott in sort of public discourse, they typically are referring to this type as a primary boycott, excuse me. But a secondary boycott is also a certain category here, which is directed at third party. So you refuse to purchase anything from someone who may sell a product that's produced by a company that you are boycotting, right? So this, you'll see like retailers who are implicated sometimes if they're carrying products that a consumer might not want to purchase. But okay, so that's the bigger context, boycotts generally. But let's maybe narrow down a little bit on what an economic boycott is. And maybe in your view, Sarthak, why do you think that consumers would choose to participate in an economic boycott?
Yeah, so the first part, what is an economic boycott? Right, so it implies you're not engaging in an economic activity. For instance, the consumers here are not buying something. And in some instances, it can also imply some producers are not willing to sell something. That can also happen.
Interesting. Oh, I had not thought about it from the other side.
Yeah, that can also happen. Again, the former is more prominent as compared to the latter. So what is this, right? Why does this happen, or what are the different kinds of instances of this happening? First instance, maybe people are not willing to buy a particular good or a service, right? That is an example of an economic boycott. For instance, maybe they don't like this movie. They don't want to watch that movie, so they can boycott that.
Yeah.
This is something which typically happens in the Indian context, right? Not willing to watch a movie, or maybe they're boycotting some book. It has happened in the past, or some performance. So these are some instances. Apart from that, people might boycott a particular firm because they think that this firm is engaged in certain practices that is not ethical, maybe. For instance, maybe this particular firm does not, or it violates different kinds of human rights, or labor rights, or it engages children in their manufacturing processes, right? So there are certain principles people align with, and if they feel that these firms in their entire supply chain, they're violative of some of these principles, they might boycott it. Another thing is, as you were mentioning, sometimes platforms might also be boycotted. The platforms are selling certain goods. You don't like that good that is being sold there. I remember a few years back, some doormat was being sold on Amazon, and the doormat had some Hindu gods or goddesses in that. So again, there was
public sentiment,
some sort of cultural sensitivities, right? So these kind of things, advertisements. In case of India, there has been a call to boycott certain products because their advertisements were not culturally palatable, maybe. So this is one kind of thing. Another kind of economic boycott is where you are targeting firms which are from certain countries, or they're based out of certain countries, because the country is engaging in certain kind of practices that you don't like.
Correct.
Right. For instance, the Russia-Ukraine war. Right. So it led to people boycotting maybe Russian products. In some cases, they might be boycotting American products because they were siding with Ukraine. Or in the Israel-Palestine conflict, there also we have seen these kind of things. So the idea here is you are boycotting these firms. The assumption is these firms will be hurt. They will possibly pressurize the governments, concerned governments, and the governments might change their policies. So all this is nothing but using some form of economic power to bring about some sort of a change. Now, the second part that you have is, why do consumers participate in all these activities, right? Why do they go for these kind of boycotts? Now, as I was mentioning, this is all expression of economic power. Now, there can be different grades here, right? One is maybe they are participating in these kind of activities because they just want to express their
Frustration,
frustration,
yeah.
their resentment, right? They don't have much power. They can't change things, but they have to show that, okay, they had this particular stance. Sometimes it might be more instrumental in nature. They want to have certain actions, right? They
Yeah.
want to get certain kinds of things done. In some cases, it might be just to draw the attention of the media. Right, so these are all media-oriented thing, right? So
Yeah,
the
yeah.
focus is on ensuring that you grab more eyeballs, and if the media captures your attention, maybe the governments will take
Change,
up
yeah.
things. They will bring about some sort of regulations, and also there are some studies which find out the linkage between trust in political institutions and
The likelihood of
likelihood of people
Yeah,
going
yeah.
for economic boycotts, right? And they find a negative association. So if people trust their political institutions,
Yes, yeah. They use the standard
yeah, there's
means
assumption
of
is
recourse.
there's assumption is the politicians will
Right. There's an accountability mechanism
there
in
is an
place.
accountability
Yeah,
mechanism.
yeah.
The politicians, the policymakers will come up with some policies. They will come up with some regulations, and you don't need to go for these
Resort
kind
to
of
these type of
measures, right?
Yeah.
And then there are also studies which try to find out the relation between trust in judicial institutions
Yes, absolutely.
and
That's
economic
huge.
boycott. And this was kind of fascinating for me. The relationship is U-shaped. For instance, if you have low trust in judicial institutions, the possibility of economic boycotts, propensity of economic boycotts is high, because you are not expecting the judiciary to
Correct.
give you justice, provide you
Yeah,
justice.
yeah.
So you will resort to
Take
different
matters into your own hands.
yeah, you will resort to different kinds of extra legal measures. However, if the trust in judicial institutions is also high, the possibility of economic boycott is also more. The reason being, people trust the judicial process in this case. The judiciary might take up some of these cases. It has come up with some findings against, let's say, some corporates.
Right.
People trust those findings, and then
Right.
they
Choose to then-
parallelly
Yeah,
they
yeah,
choose
yeah.
to protest. Maybe they will resort to things like
Interesting.
economic boycott. So there is this
That's
U-shaped
so
linkage.
interesting. I like the latter part of that curve, right? This idea that you can trust your institution to the extent where you use their findings to then almost have that sort of, I don't want to say vigilante sort of
Complement.
approach, but yeah, almost to complement it, right? And to say that we're going to reinforce.
Reinforce,
We're going
yeah.
to try and reinforce, yeah.
So these are some of the reasons why people
People choose
tend
to participate, yeah.
participate in economic boycotts.
Yeah, yeah. Fascinating. And I think, I'm curious to also understand, like, now if we go into, we've not talked about which cultural context maybe you might see more likelihood of this playing out. Again, I think there's an overlap with what you just said, like depending on the trust that people have in their institutions, that will sort of, that's seemingly a big factor in determining whether they would choose to participate in something like this. But we've been very broadly speaking of like people in a particular country, when they're dissatisfied, they participate in these types of protests, let's say, or expression of discontent rather. But the truth is actually there are sort of fragmented groupings within a society that might choose to participate in this type of activity, right? And interesting, we were also discussing a study that this type of political consumer, essentially a consumer that makes choices based on a personal political belief, perhaps, looks like a very particular type of person. We're not talking about all members of society equally choose to participate in this. Some may have a desire to, but may choose not to participate for a number of reasons that we can sort of cover. But largely, who do you see sort of express this type of outrage in this economic fashion? What type of consumer really participates in a boycott like this? My guess is folks who have the capacity to do so, who are likely, you don't see, a much younger sort of population participating. Sometimes the disposable income they have accessible to them makes it hard to make certain types of choices. They can't afford to ideologically say, I'm not going to purchase a cheaper item because they're so constrained by, the limited resources that they may have. Also, folks who understand the political process maybe a little bit more and who recognize that there's value in, participating in it in this way, they might jump in. And yeah, I think those typically seem to be, I don't see a lot of younger folks, but it seems like it's a lot of middle-aged, well-educated, politically literate folks who seem to take up this type of cause.
Yeah, so Kripa, nice points, right? For instance, if someone is not having sufficient incomes, right, for them the choices are limited.
Limited, yeah.
Right? If you are boycotting particular goods, most likely those goods were in your economy because they had some comparative advantage,
Yeah,
right?
compared to a domestic producer.
Yeah, compared to the domestic economy, right? So your domestic economy had imported these goods. They had a market for these goods because most likely they were of good quality or they were cheaper.
Right.
So if you are price sensitive consumer, your incomes are low,
Yeah.
then I mean you cannot choose to just boycott it and buy something which is more expensive. So these kind of factors do play a role.
Yeah.
Apart from that, as you were mentioning, there will be some people who are ideologically inclined. They will be part of certain groups, membership of certain groups. Maybe because of that, they're more inclined to participate in these kind of things.
Right.
But not all will participate, definitely. So there is this elasticity concept which applies here as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. I would not have necessarily applied it in that way. Yeah, actually, an interesting point also is I think coming back to maybe how literate you might be on some of these issues, like how well read you might be, is also so contingent on the mediums you have access to, right? Like if you are someone who is very digitally literate, you have access to media for consuming types of information, you're able to maybe keep abreast of all these developments, you're able to track some of it, you have the bandwidth and capacity even to follow news in that certain way, and therefore you're more likely to try and advocate for changes to happen in a particular policy. So that sort of covers, I think, the folks that we might typically see perhaps leading a lot of this momentum, and you know, I think it's an important point to mention because it's true even in the French context, right? Like even the poll that I'd cited earlier was making reference to the fact that, you know, these type of political consumers exactly fit the characterization that we've given them. It's tended to be folks who fit this category. So it's interesting to see that parallel in this specific context.
I just want to add one thing. Some of the things which involve culture, for instance, right? This is against our culture. So there I'm not sure whether people who are more literate or who are more well informed, right? They will be the ones who are participating. I would assume that people who are well informed would not necessarily participate in boycotting movies or boycotting performances.
Right. I guess it's the type of boycott also, right? Like what type of product is being boycotted? You would see certain types of products perhaps might be, or certain types of actions might be boycotted more likely by a certain segment of society versus, like you're right, I wouldn't see this exact same segment of the population protesting against like things that would offend, you know, cultural sentiments perhaps. And in an economic boycott, one more point I think I just want to mention was, you know, when you're talking of like older folks who seem to be participating in these type of boycotts, it's also because they have the financial sway, like they spend more in the market as well. And so their decision making perhaps also carries a little bit more weight and impact possibly.
Maybe.
Yeah. But interesting, yeah, to introduce a little bit of nuance, I think, as to not always will you see a perfect alignment sometimes in the type of boycott and the consumer participating. But yeah, so the other thing I did want to sort of cover a little bit of ground on was, you know, ultimately, there's a lot of hope with which people approach the activity of boycotting, right? You come with this expectation, there are certain objectives that are in place. And so you ultimately, the dream is that a boycott is going to be effective and meet certain objectives, right? But let's ask the bigger question, right? Like what does it look like for a boycott to be effective? What does effectiveness look like in this context? Who decides how effective a boycott really is? So I think that's useful to sort of introduce over here at this point.
Yeah, so I will be frank here. It's very difficult to measure effectiveness because of multiple reasons, right? First of all, those who are organizing these boycotts, they might not necessarily pin down what are the objectives.
Clear, yeah. It's too broad in what they're trying to achieve.
It might be, I mean, they're just talking about an action, but they might not have a very clearly defined objective.
Strategy, yeah.
So if I have to measure effectiveness, then I have to compare it with the objectives of a particular action, right? So the clarity might not be there, the objectives might not be defined. Apart from that, this entire thing, right, economic boycott, involves certain execution part, the operation part, where you're calling for action, but then there are also consequences, right, of that. So are you talking about the effectiveness of execution? Are you talking about the effectiveness of the consequence? And consequence will also be short-term, long-term.
Right,
Immediately, maybe you called for economic boycott of American goods in France, maybe the sales went down. But then it has long-term consequences,
Sure.
right? Because again, some people, as we are discussing, those who are from the weaker economic sections, they now have to pay higher amount of money for the same goods which is being produced by the domestic economy. So there is transfer of resource from the poorer section to the local manufacturers, right? So again, is this a consequence that you would want?
Right.
So there is variation, right? Short-term consequence, long-term consequence, there will be variation. Apart from that, if there is any change in the economy or in the consumption patterns, right? How do you exactly attribute it to the boycott? Maybe there were some other factors at play, right? So
it's hard to isolate that.
Hard to isolate that. And both the sides, right? They will try to say that, I mean, they will give a favorable view of what happened. So it's always very dicey to find out whether this particular movement was effective or not. That said, what we can do is we can possibly break down this entire process into parts, right? One is the organization part, where you are trying to initiate an economic boycott, which will involve the leadership, individuals who are participating here, their membership in an organization, right? And then you can figure out whether this thing happened or not, right? The first part, whether they were able to initiate it.
Right.
And here again, the role of the government plays an important role. Because the role of the government is important, because if the government doesn't allow, if the state doesn't allow for these kind of things
organization
then it will fail. The second part is the actual action part. Right. So where you are saying that you are not going to buy a particular good. Now here, there are multiple factors at play. What kind of good you are trying to boycott? The example that we saw. If that good is something which is essential, which is critical, it is not easy to boycott it, because you are dependent on it. But if it is not something which is essential, you can possibly boycott it. The movie and all those things will fall under that category, right? So a movie or a book may not be essential, right? So you can boycott it. Apart from that, how many substitutes this particular good has, right? Let's say I'm boycotting a product from America or whatever, but I can easily get those substitutes, right? From, let's say, China or from some other places. Then again, the boycott can be effective, right? So availability of substitutes, and here what we imply with substitute is the quality of the good should be comparable. The price should be comparable. If US is able to manufacture something which is extraordinary, and you are saying I'm going to boycott American goods, then you're losing out, because whatever you're going to use it is going to be substandard, right? You are losing out on efficiency. So there is a requirement for those kind of perfect substitutes. One example we can see here is how many of these fast food chains, right? McDonald's, KFC's, right? They lost businesses because during the Israel-Palestine conflict, they lost businesses in places like Malaysia. They lost businesses because
there are so many substitutes
right?
available.
It's not very difficult to make
and
burgers.
equally satisfactory substitutes.
However, many other software firms, let's say Amazon, Google, right? They also have American linkages, right? But they did not lose their customer base, because you don't have
a very competitive
substitutes, right? So the role of substitutes is very important. Apart from that, the domestic economy, what kind of comparative advantage it has? Is it
ready to bear the consequences?
It is ready to bear the consequences. Is it an economy which is resilient? Can it start producing something quickly? How good it is the economy in doing all those things? That also plays an important bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, another thing which can have a dampening effect on the effectiveness of economic boycott is, how do you find out whatever you are boycotting, that product? How do you attribute that this particular product belongs to this particular nation state?
What percentage of that product has to be
because,
made in America to be considered
global
American?
Supply chains, right? Maybe part of it is manufactured in US. Other things are maybe from your
own country.
So it's very difficult to attribute, right? So it will again, your intention might be whatever, but you are not getting the results. So again, you have to be mindful of all these things.
Totally. And I'm sorry, I was just trying to interrupt, but I just was thinking of products, to say that I'm boycotting goods made by a particular country
Yeah.
is such an interesting one, because like there are obviously, if you think of the host of products that any particular country manufactures and then exports, it has permeated your country's domestic market in so many ways. It's not as
Exactly.
simple as saying, I'm not going to eat food. This particular food brand I'm really against. You think of like so many other segments in society that are upheld by having an American presence, for example, in this example we keep pulling up, like or American products or manufacturers. That's such an incredibly tough one to sort of say, right? We're not restricting our conversation to
Yeah.
only food and beverage. We're talking of so much more.
Exactly. And again, even in food and beverage, right, the packaging material would have come from somewhere, right? So you don't know, right?
Sure.
So we're all, everything is kind of interconnected. And
Damn globalization. Huh?
globalization. And another thing we should also keep in mind is, or at least economic boycott should keep in mind is, you're just looking at boycott, or you're trying to boycott a particular product, you're just looking at it from you're looking at it partially. You're just looking at, okay, I'm boycotting this good, one dimension,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm boycotting this particular product. I'm not going to buy this product. Now, what are the long-term consequences of that?
Sure.
Right? So if you're not buying that product, which implies that, as I mentioned some time back, you are indirectly transferring resources
Yeah.
from the poorer economic sections to the domestic producers.
Yeah.
Right? So there is an opportunity cost for all these things. Maybe the domestic producers were good at something else. They could have done that instead of they doing this. So somewhere there is efficiency loss. You're losing out on capital. Maybe it will lead to a situation where innovation and all those things can get impacted in the long run.
I can totally see that, just because as soon as you remove a competitor from the market, especially one that is nearly as significant as some of these, American brands have been able to carve out a fair bit of market share for themselves.
Correct.
It does reduce the amount of competition, and then in turn the consequence on the quality of
it will lead to
Yeah.
lack of efficiency, or that lack of efficiency will continue, right? If you don't have enough competition. So this was the second part that we're talking about.
Right,
There's another
middle
third
phase,
part, right? When you're boycotting firms from a particular country, the assumption is the firms will now put pressure
on their local
that,
governments, lobby them.
on the local governments, and then the policies will change, or the action that that particular government is engaged in, it will change. Here again, there are multiple assumptions.
Sure.
Right? The assumption here is the firms
have the capacity to even speak to coerce
they
their
have
government.
They are, first of all, they have
Influence,
they're heard so much that they will go back and influence the government.
Sure.
Then again, they have the capacity to influence the governments, and again the governments will take action. Right?
So in a way, you have to hope that you are a significant enough market for that company in order for them to feel the pinch.
Exactly.
If you only have a small little share in my country, then they don't actually give a shit.
Correct. So that might be the case, right? So maybe this particular firms, right, they have a huge market presence, right? In that case, this might not impact them much, and in that case, nothing is going to change. But that doesn't mean that these people should not boycott.
That's right.
If someone wants to,
sure, but it's being aware of like some of the constraints of your approach. Then,
correct.
Yeah. And then I guess the other point you were saying was, one, should they care? And second, do they have the capacity to actually influence the government of the day?
So again, if all these things happen, then the economic boycott will be effective. Effective,
sure.
Again, what is effective?
By the definition of, it's a complicated one. Yeah.
So, and if this happens, then political mobilization wise, they are effective. We are not sure about the economic consequences.
Right. Because I think when some folks think of, or the argument often made for like an effective boycott usually is that, look, if you're able to attract sufficient media attention, and if you can maintain the momentum of these actions of saying, I'm constantly going to choose an alternate to this supposed country or company I'm trying to boycott, if these two parameters are sort of met, then that is considered an effective boycott, right? But I think, as you rightly pointed out, that might be a very shallow interpretation of what, how effective this type of action can be, right? And of course, this is not to deter from, we are sort of talking about the constraints around this type of activity, but there have been very successful movements, boycott movements, that have been able to convey all the conditions have felt right. The pinch has been felt by the right person. It's translated into a ripple effect of, decision-making authority or the state often having maybe changing its course, or a company changing its course. So there have been instances where it's been, and I think which is why no matter how many potential challenges we're outlining here, people still see it as a worthwhile activity to participate in because of the precedent that's been set in many ways of successful boycotts that have happened, right? And again, successful understood as we've got a country to change its policy, we've got a company to stop producing certain products in an unethical way, for example, or things like that. So yeah, so I think it is complicated. I think it seems like a fair sort of conclusion to land on. But I think we've covered a fair bit of ground. But I'm just wondering, like, if we were to sort of wrap up, like, what really would we have to say around the effectiveness of boycotts, right? Is it something that's a worthwhile activity to participate in? Maybe, I mean, for each organizing group might have their own response to that. They might be well aware, in fact, of all the economic consequences, and might still choose to participate in it for whatever their objectives might be. But I think it's good to be clear-eyed about it, right? That there will be negative consequences that you might not anticipate or intend. As much as there might be a negative consequence on a certain country, perhaps, or a certain company, there are so many more ripple effects sort of to this that you might not have anticipated. And maybe even just the question of perhaps, is a boycott the most effective way to achieve those objectives? You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, in fact, I have some thoughts on this.
Oh, yeah.
So again, one of the objective of economic boycotts is putting pressure on certain corporates to change their practices. Right. So this is one way to go about it. Now, this can also be solved through market competition. Right. For instance, let's say there are firms which are engaging in practices which are not great for the environment.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, what you can do, you can have mechanisms. Again, there is a role of state here, right? The state has to fill in certain roles. It has to reduce the information asymmetry that exists, right? What kind of practices these firms are specifically engaging in, right? If there is some sort of mandatory disclosure norms and those things. And you create mechanisms by which more firms can participate, reduce the barriers to entry into the sector. So that
I think both have to happen.
Yeah, both have to happen
concurrently.
Right?
Yeah.
So that way, what will happen is there will be firms who can signal that okay, we are the ones
distinct from our competitors.
Distinct from our competitors. We are doing this better than them.
Sure.
We are not harming the environment, and not just environment, right? It can be about
a host of issues that people take issues with. Yeah.
So, if that functions, you have greater competition. There are the signaling mechanisms working. So these kind of firms which are engaging in practices which are harmful will gradually lose their market share.
Which is so unsatisfying for someone who's so passionately unhappy with a certain country or a government policy. Like, to be told that maybe your government needs to be a little bit more involved in reducing barriers for entry in an industry doesn't feel like, it doesn't scratch the itch in the same way.
But think about it. We saw that there is if there is high trust in political institutions, the possibility of economic boycotts are low. This is what it possibly refers to or implies. Right? If politicians, policymakers, and citizens, they're on the same page, there might not be any need for boycott.
For something like this,
policymakers will come up with what which ensures that
satisfactorily responds to the concerns of their citizens.
Corporates are regulated. Now, the second part, where the intention was to boycott firms which are associated with countries which are involved in certain actions that you don't like. Again, for this, I don't have a clear-cut answer. The way you can influence other countries is if you have brute power.
That's right. So it's maybe a harsh reality sometimes to have to confront. Which,
some of us have talked about, talks about it. The law of the jungle, Matsya Nyaya. You have to acquire power over time, and
to be able to
be of different types.
Coerce or
So economic power is an example of that. And to build all these things, you have to invest in basic stuff.
It's true.
Human capital, ensure that there is economic freedom, all the things which lead to greater productivity over time. That can help maybe.
Yeah,
definitely. If you are having a wealthy population, you have a large consumer base with high disposable income, which can influence policies. Or else,
I was thinking of, possibly even having like these overarching multilateral global institutions that have the capacity to tie some of the threads together. So you are able to use that block power in a way to sort of push, certain objectives. So not to leave, I think, folks feeling a bit disheartened, like, okay, where does my country land in the grand scheme of being able to, exert this type of brute power? And if I don't meet, what's a typically understood threshold for brute power, then the likelihood of me being successful in a boycott is low. There are ways even to work around some of that, right? Like that's when you form like certain coalitions and alliances, and you can actually operate as a bloc. And there are ways in which many countries that typically might be seen as not having that type of power are able to still achieve some of those objectives because they band with like-minded folks as well. Yeah. Yeah. So, I think it's really helpful, I think, to consider some of the complexity of it. I think as much as, we're seeing a lot of, boycotts capture headlines and attention, and really it feels like I can't even read about a certain country that's not in a way implicated in some of this, citizens being unhappy with the way certain economic decisions are being made, and citizens having a desire to express that discontent, everything from within the US itself. A lot of brands you see are being held to account by citizens who are not happy with DI policies being rolled back, or whether it's in Canada as well, where folks are unhappy with how the tariff war has sort of been playing out. But I'm hoping that our conversation today has given folks like a little bit of an understanding of the complexity involved in a decision like this, right? As much as, of course, a movement like this can maybe generate a fair bit of momentum, and you can feel very galvanized and passionate about wanting to participate in something like this. It's really good to be mindful of some of the strategic elements of it and the complex considerations. So I'll stop over there. I'll invite our listeners to read a little bit more about some of what we've discussed and apply some of, I'm hoping, a little bit of this economic reasoning to interpreting a lot of what's being read as well. But with that, I'll conclude. I will thank Sarthak for joining me. A real pleasure. And yeah, folks, we'll see you at the next All Things Policy episode. Take care.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.